Welcome to Seneca Lake Mysteries, the podcast where we explore the unusual, strange, and unexplained on New York's largest Finger Lake. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm not sure how many of you have heard the announcement about an upcoming study of Seneca Lake and the Seneca Lake Drums, but I did, and I'm pretty intrigued and excited. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the story, the Seneca Lake Drums, or Seneca Lake Guns, are unexplained booming sounds coming from within Seneca Lake that have been heard for centuries. The lake drums have been written about, discussed, and researched and pondered by writers and journalists and scientists for almost as long as people have been hearing them. They're described as sounding like distant thunder, gunshots, or drums. And some historians say that stories of the drums date back to the Owasco people who lived near Seneca Lake but left the area around the year 1220 due to drought before the Seneca people lived around the lake. Now, similar sounds have been heard around the world. In Bangladesh, India, along the Ganges River, they call the sounds the Barisal guns. In Japan, they're called Minari, which means sounds of the sea. People in Belgium and Netherlands call them mispofers. In Italy, they're called brontiti. And in France, the sounds are referred to as baume de mer. And in the United States, not only on Seneca Lake, but in other places as well, they're commonly referred to as Seneca guns. Different explanations have been offered for the lake drums, but the most widely accepted is that the sounds are caused by natural gas bubbles leaking through fissures in the bottom of the lake and rising to the surface, creating a booming sound. And people who believe that theory claim that reports of lake drums stopped when natural gas extraction and salt mining began near Seneca Lake. But although the number of reports did drop off in the early 20th century, people never stopped hearing the drums. People still hear them today. Then a few years ago, researchers began an effort to complete the most comprehensive and detailed mapping of the bottom of Seneca Lake ever done, and the results were published last March. I really didn't expect to see what I saw in those images when I looked at them. And in the southern one-third of the lake, there are dozens of circular and oval holes in the bottom of the lake. I've looked at a lot of different depth maps of Seneca in the past, but none of them look like this. So it's really very interesting to me, and I'm curious to know more about how these holes were formed, how common they are. Are there other lakes with these kind of holes? I got a lot of questions. So it was announced last week that researchers from Cornell University and SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry received a grant of around $12,000 to study these newly discovered holes in the bottom of the lake and to determine if methane gas or other chemicals are being released from these holes, which would explain the Seneca drums phenomenon. So I can't wait to see what they find and see if they can finally solve the unsolvable mystery. So I'm going to post a link to the bathymetric mapping results from the DEC, as well as an edited version of the map of the lake bottom. I'm going to put those in the description. So keep in mind the study results from the DEC are really huge files that can be difficult to manage and view on the average PC. So you probably want to look at the image I edited and reduced to a more manageable size. So with that said, this is the first installment about the iconic Seneca Army Depot, the land where it's located, the people who once lived there, and the depot's founding, and its extraordinary, globally influential history, its ties to the Manhattan Project, and the massive nuclear arsenal that was once stored in the secretive Q area. Then we'll leave the depot, cross Route 96A, and get into some tales of the Sampson Naval Training Center, including the truly odd story of an appearance by Adolf Hitler's nephew. And finally, inspired by the newly announced study of the lake drums, we'll go through some of the old stories of underwater tunnels at the bottom of Seneca Lake, which were rumored to be connected to the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and a small lake down in Elmira. So yeah, if you enjoy the show, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and get over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com and sign up for the mailing list. I've got some really cool new things to announce soon about the whole Seneca Lake Mysteries project and stuff I'll be doing in addition to the podcast, and I'm really excited about it. So subscribe to the mailing list and you'll be the first to know everything coming up in the next few weeks. So thanks again for listening, and let's get into it. The Seneca Army Depot, which operated from 1941 until its official closure in 1995, was not only an important and central part of the lives of the people who lived in the communities around the installation, but it also played an outsized role in all American military actions for those 5+ decades, including World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the invasions of Panama and Grenada, and the First Gulf War. The story of the Seneca Lake Depot is unusual, often strange, and occasionally unexplained. So let's dive into the history of the facility beginning more than a century and a half before it was built. Prior to the American Revolutionary War, Kendaya was reportedly one of the oldest villages in the Iroquois Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Located not far from the eastern shore, about 12 miles south of the northern tip of Seneca Lake, there were between 20 and 30 longhouses in Kendaya, each longhouse housing roughly 8 Seneca Nation families. And nearby, there was an orchard of about 80 fruit trees, primarily apple trees, but also with a handful of peach trees as well, along with a few small fields of corn. The Sullivan Campaign of 1779 was a military offensive initiated by General George Washington to stop the Haudenosaunee nations from siding with the British. However, Sullivan and his men weren't just interested in fighting the native people. They also destroyed homes, crops, food supplies, devastating the populations of the Haudenosaunee in an horrific and brutal way. Sullivan's forces arrived at Kendaya on September 3rd, 1779, but most of the residents had already fled. So the soldiers destroyed the longhouses, they burned the cornfields, and either cut down or girdled the fruit trees. And girdling a tree means you tear off all the bark on the lower part of the trunk, which eventually kills the entire tree. And the Seneca people would never return to Kendaya. Then in 1823, the land was purchased by Gerard Van Vliet and remained in the Van Vliet family for several generations. While the Van Vliet family uncovered numerous Indian artifacts while plowing the land, Gerard made a promise to the Seneca people at the time that their burial grounds would never be disturbed, and the family kept that promise. And today, the old Van Vliet family cemetery remains inside the boundary of Sampson State Park, along with the burial grounds of the Seneca people. Then in 1941, the U.S. War Department and President Franklin Roosevelt believed that the U.S. was about to get drawn into World War II and made a decision to build 4 Army depots roughly in the 4 corners of the United States in New York State, Alabama, California, and Oregon. Not only were these weapons at these armories to be used in overseas battlefields, they were also stored in the event of an enemy attack on the United States. So the Army found the perfect location in New York on roughly 11,000 acres of farmland between Seneca and Cayuga Lakes. Now, there were 2 reasons why the Army found this location to be perfect. At least two reasons that they gave. One, there were railroad lines going up and down both sides of the site, which was ideal not only for transporting supplies to build the depot, but also shipping and receiving ammunition and other materials. The second reason they gave was the shale bedrock, which is just a few inches underneath the topsoil in some places. And they found that that was ideal because in the event of an explosion, the layers of shale would break and absorb the impact rather than possibly creating a chain reaction to the other nearby storage igloos that held ammunition as well. So once the decision was made to build the new depot on this land, an immediate effort to remove the roughly 130 families from their homes on this land began. Residents received letters in the mail telling them that the government would be buying their land and they would need to move out immediately, anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks to move their entire lives off of the land. Now, many of them were young families who suddenly had to gather whatever they could, load it onto wagons or other vehicles, and find somewhere else to live. Their crops, their gardens, their homes were all left behind. A few lucky people were able to have their houses physically moved, but most of the people had to leave behind their homes and everything. The government did offer payouts for the land, but those payouts were much lower than what the actual value of the homes and the land were. But if the residents turned down the offer for the payout, the government would just condemn the homes and push the families out anyway. Ultimately, about 160 parcels of land owned by roughly 130 different families were deeded to the U.S. government. And during that time period, the U.S. government and the media offered a narrative of proud, patriotic Americans who happily gave up their homes for the war effort. While this may have been the case with a small number of the displaced residents, there were also many stories of people whose lives were never the same, who never trusted the government again, who went through incredible stress and pain and difficulty and trauma during that time. But thankfully, in more recent years, a more authentic and balanced story of the dispossessed families of the Seneca Army Depot is being told. And also, it is hard to overlook the parallels between these families and the residents of Kendaya who were forced from their homes 162 years prior. And coincidentally, Kendaya was located not far from the southern end of the Army Depot. Now, the U.S. Army needed this area that would contain the depot to be completely flattened for security reasons. And once all the people had moved out, the effort to completely clear and flatten the entire depot property began. So bulldozers ran railroad ties on steel cables between them and ripped through homes, churches, and anything else that was in their way. They burned down barns as soon as the residents had left. They burned the crops. Everything was leveled until nothing was left standing in a 17 square mile area where families had lived just weeks before. A 24-mile fence was built around the entire property, and the $8 million project to build the Seneca Army Depot began. And just to note, $8 million in 1941 is the equivalent of $174 million in 2025. So this was a massive effort. And right away, a few thousand workers were hired at first to build the depot, with the majority of them from larger cities like Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, but also from nearby smaller cities like Geneva and Seneca Falls. However, at some point they realized they needed more workers to complete the project on time. So they hired more until eventually there was a total of around 8,600 new workers on site. Now, this massive influx of people into this rural area was incredibly disruptive. All the area hotels were booked. Workers had to sleep in vehicles. Tent cities popped up around the area, and even residents were renting out rooms in their homes for the workers. Pretty soon, very serious issues with sanitation and the lack of housing led the feds to come in and build a trailer park for workers at the county fairgrounds in Waterloo. So the Seneca Army Depot required 500 solid concrete structures called igloos to be built. Now, each one of these ammunition igloos were 15 feet tall, 20 feet wide, and 60 to 80 feet deep inside. The concrete floor was roughly 18 inches thick, but the concrete at the top of the structure was thinner so that the force of any potential explosion would go up instead of out to the side, where it could possibly cause explosions in other igloos. And the 500 igloos were completed in just 3 months, with the final igloo being done on November 15th, 1941. 3 weeks later, Pearl Harbor was attacked and the U.S. entered World War II. For the next 3 years and 9 months, the Seneca Army Depot stored, manufactured, and shipped a large percentage of the weapons, along with other supplies, vehicles, etc., that were used in the war effort. The depot was basically also a self-sufficient small city with its own police and fire departments, post office, and rail stations. It also became a live ammunition training area after the Sampson Naval Training Center opened less than a year later. Sampson was built in 270 days on a 66-acre parcel between the east shore of the lake and the depot. By the end of World War II, over 411,000 recruits had been trained at Sampson, with between 4,000 and 5,000 naval personnel also working on the base at that time. And Sampson was closed due to the end of the war. After a few years of being used as a college for 15,000 GI Bill students, it was then used by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to store wheat and beans. Then, in November 1950, with the start of the Korean War, the facility was taken over by the Air Force and became the Sampson Air Force Base. And by 1956, over 300,000 Air Force recruits had been trained there. Meanwhile, in February of 1955, 1,120 acres at the Seneca Army Depot was designated for a new facility that would be built to store quote-unquote special weapons. This area was called the Q area, and it had the highest level of security designation available. And by July of 1956, several new buildings plus 64 brand new specialized storage igloos were built. 3 barbed wire and chain link fences surrounded the Q area. The middle fence was electrified with 4,800 volts, which is more than double the electricity of an electric chair. So anyone who touched that fence, it would result in immediate death. Of course, numerous military police officers with shoot-to-kill orders guarded the entire perimeter of the Q area 24/7, along with state-of-the-art camera surveillance, even back in the 50s and 60s, when camera surveillance was extraordinarily rare. Now, to backtrack just a little bit, back in the 1940s, around 2,000 barrels that were marked Manhattan were delivered to and stored in igloos EO181 through EO811 at the southern end of the depot. It was later learned that those barrels contained uranium pitchblende, which was used in the Manhattan Project that created the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the Q area opened, it became the largest single storage area for nuclear weapons, parts, and materials in the entire country. And if the story of the Seneca Army Depot isn't strange enough for you, in 1949, a military officer at the depot spotted 2 white-tailed deer on the grounds of the facility. But these weren't ordinary deer. They had all-white fur, and thus began the era of the Seneca white deer, a story we will be exploring a lot more in a future episode or episodes. But before we move on, there's one more story from the Sampson Naval Training Base that sounds so offbeat, you might think it's a weird, dark joke, but it isn't, and here it is. In 1944, a new recruit arrived at Sampson, and that recruit was the nephew of Adolf Hitler. William Patrick Hitler, whose father was the half-brother of Adolf, was born in 1911 and raised in Liverpool, England. After William had reconnected with his father around age 18, his father had abandoned the family when he was very young, so he reconnected with his father around age 18, and he traveled to Germany and met, for the first time, his uncle Adolf, who gave him an autographed photo. And then William returned to England in 1931 and ended up publishing several unflattering articles about his uncle Adolf. And this enraged his uncle, who demanded that the articles be retracted and even threatened suicide if William ever published another article with personal information about him again. Now, eventually, William's relationship with Adolf Hitler became public, and he was fired from his job and shamed in his home country of England. He later tried to return to Germany, but Adolf Hitler publicly denied that they were related. So William began gathering evidence to prove that he was Adolf's nephew, with the plan to blackmail Adolf Hitler into allowing William back into the country. And in 1933, William again went to Germany, and this time he confronted his uncle with the proof that he had found. And his uncle Adolf ended up giving him some money and helping him find work. But after a few years, William was fired again, and after he had a meeting with his uncle Adolf, and in this meeting, his crazed uncle was cracking a bullwhip and was completely enraged. And William said, okay, enough is enough. He returned to England, and now he was determined to fight in World War II in the war effort against his uncle. But the British Armed Forces rejected him due to his last name. So in 1939, William moved to the United States and began writing to President Roosevelt begging to be allowed in the U.S. Armed Forces. And it took a few years, but eventually President Roosevelt relented, and William Patrick Hitler was sworn into the U.S. Navy on March 6, 1944 in New York City, before he departed for basic training at Sampson Naval Training Center. Now, William Hitler served 3 years in the U.S. Navy as a pharmacist's mate before he was discharged in 1947 and awarded a Purple Heart for an injury he apparently suffered during his service. After leaving the military, William unsurprisingly changed his last name to Stuart Houston. He married and ran a blood analysis laboratory on Long Island in Patchogue, New York. William had 4 children, and strangely, he gave each of them the middle name of Adolf. So last week it was announced that researchers from Cornell University and the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry received a grant to study the recently discovered holes in the bottom of Seneca Lake and to determine if methane or other chemicals released from those holes could explain the Seneca Drums phenomenon. So I thought it was an opportune time to look at those long-time rumors of underwater tunnels in the lake, where those tunnels may lead, and if those tunnels were tied to the Seneca drums. So 1908 was a big year for claims of tunnels connecting not only to the Atlantic Ocean, but also the Pacific. So in 1908, local residents had already believed for years that Seneca Lake's waters had moved in conjunction with the tides of the ocean, and that there were parts of Seneca where no bottom had been found. So in April of 1908, a lone fisherman, unnamed in a news report, was rowing across the lake just north of Valois around 9 p.m., a time when the lake drum sounds were commonly reported, especially in that area of the lake. And the man not only said he heard the lake guns, but then there was a violent eruption on the lake's surface. The man leaned over and he decided he would taste the water. So he tasted a sample of the water and said that it had a strong, distinct taste of salt. And then he spotted a piece of wood bobbing in the waves and reached down, retrieved the piece of wood, and realized it was the bow gunwale, which is the front upper edge of a large whaling boat. And inscribed on that piece of wood were the words, John P. Sullivan, Gloucester, Mass. And after investigating later on, it was revealed that there was a whaling boat from Gloucester with the same name that had wrecked off of Cape Hatteras on the Atlantic Ocean just over a year prior in the winter of 1906-1907. And then, a few months later, in June of 1908, E.C. Havens, who was a local pharmacist and Watkins Village trustee, began telling people the story, publicly sharing this story about a highly unusual marine species that had been caught near Hector Falls. The witness was identified as a Mr. Hausner, and he provided E.C. Havens with a detailed description of this strange fish that had been caught. He said it had the general shape of a trout or perch, but with a hooked lower jaw that fit into a groove or a cavity in the upper jaw. The fish's teeth were pointed backward, and its head and back were a gold-brown bronze color that gradually shaded into a lighter color. It had a white belly and a white tail and an iridescent stripe that ran along the body and small, oddly colored spots on the entire back. So he had a very detailed description. It was around 18 inches long and weighed about 2.5 pounds. And local scholars concluded that the fish was a type of shark normally found in the Pacific Ocean near California and the Mediterranean Sea, known as a starry smoothhound, a skate-toothed shark, or a ray-toothed dog. And the species name was Mutellus hinulus. And now the witnesses concluded that because this species of shark had never been previously found in any freshwater and couldn't have been born in the lake, the only explanation was that the shark had arrived to Seneca Lake via an underground passage with an opening that they believed existed just north of Valois, where the lake guns were most commonly reported. Now, there's no further information about what happened to the ray-toothed dog or skate-toothed shark or starry smoothhound or whatever you want to call it. But still, now there were two stories. One telling of a tunnel to the Atlantic Ocean, another telling of a tunnel to the Pacific Ocean. And now we have a third story from a few years later, 1953. And the story actually begins in Elmira, New York, which is about 20 miles south of Seneca Lake. So in 1953, an Elmira city councilor named Walter Wichtowski was looking into different ways to address the city's need for increased amounts of drinking water. So he wrote a letter to the city water board with a proposal suggesting that they build a 20-mile pipeline to carry water from Seneca Lake to Elmira. He received a response from the city water board stating that not only would such a project cost a staggering $7 million, which is about $83 million in 2025, that it would also create unspecified, quote, political and international complications, end quote. So this was clearly something the city water board wasn't going to approve, but Walter Wichtowski wasn't going to give up so easily. So the next week, Walter recommended that the city request a survey of Eldridge Lake to discover whether there was any truth to the legend of an underground connection to Seneca Lake. Wichtowski cited numerous stories from local residents pointing out that if the connection was already there, drinking water could be pulled from Seneca Lake without the need to construct a pipeline. And what was Eldridge Lake? Eldridge Lake is a small 11-acre glacial lake in the city of Elmira. In 1857, a Dr. Edwin Eldridge purchased the lake and the surrounding 200 acres around it. And after he performed extensive landscaping, he installed Victorian statues, he made the lake larger, he built a turtle and frog pond, he constructed a casino with a restaurant, an ice cream parlor, and finally in 1870 he opened Eldridge Park to the public. Sadly, Dr. Eldridge died about 6 years later in 1876, and his family members took care of the park before they sold it to the city of Elmira in 1899. And later attractions included boat rides, carousels, and even bear pits, because bear fights were a popular spectator activity of the time. And it's exactly what it sounds like, pits with bears in them fighting. According to locals, as mentioned, Eldridge Lake was also connected to Seneca Lake via underground tunnels. So there were stories of people and animals who disappeared in Eldridge Lake only to have their corpses surface in Seneca Lake. Sometimes those corpses were covered with strange, unexplained bite marks. Another story from around 1903 said that 2 boats had an accident on Seneca Lake, with debris from both of those boats later showing up in Eldridge Lake. And then there was a sawmill that would treat its logs by floating them in Eldridge Lake. But then they started having numerous logs simply disappearing from Eldridge and appearing in Seneca Lake. So the Elmira City Council agreed to the request to have Cornell University send experts to determine if the underground tunnel between Eldridge Lake and Seneca Lake actually existed. So they did the survey and they determined that, unsurprisingly, the tunnel did not exist. And not only that, but Eldridge Lake was not bottomless. Its deepest point was 39 feet. Well, that's it for this time around. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. And if you have any thoughts on any of the topics in this episode, please let me know. And remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and get over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com and subscribe to the email list so you don't miss anything. A new podcast comes out every month on the 7s. I'll talk to you then.